All right, welcome to part three of our hybrid level three spirits coursework. And for tonight's session, we're obviously going to cover Asian spirits. And for the outcome here for this evening, you're really going to be looking at a number of different things. And with Asian spirits, this is something that's a little bit challenging to those of us who work in the West and don't necessarily deal with Asian spirits on a regular basis. And it's important to understand that not all of this is actually examinable, but there are aspects of it that are going to be involved in both the um, multiple choice questions, as well as components of it might come up in other aspects of the written theory questions, mainly in the, compare and contrast or describe the differences between, it could be solid state versus semi-solid state versus liquid fermentation and whatnot. So this is a really good seminar, and it has a lot of stuff in it. So we're gonna kind of blast through this and cover it in some detail. And obviously, if there's questions, please let me know. But it's a lot of material, and there's a lot of good information here that like I said, is not always available to us in the West as far as the drink industry goes. So we like to start with a little bit of slight review, in the respect that we're just going to kind of go over starch conversion, because at this point in the game, we've learned about how, at least in the West, in American European type of distillation, grains are handled and how sugar is actually extracted from that. So just to kind of get it started, and this should be at this point a little bit of a review, but if it's not, it'll be a good catch up. So plants produce starch granules. These are essentially longer strains of sugar molecules that are combined together. You got to remember that a grain is a seed, and that seed needs some energy to be able to grow when springtime starts and propagate a new plant. It has to weather over the winter, and so the plants themselves, the grasses like wheats and barley and whatnot, have developed a mechanism for storing that energy through the production of starch granules, which are you're only going to find them in grains, but they store these and protect the starch granules in a solid protein net, which is just a really good defensive mechanism to be able to protect and consolidate the sugar or the energy that it's going to need in the springtime in order to grow. And so the process of modification comes along. And what modification really means is it's how the plant eventually breaks down those starch granules into simple sugars that it's going to need to use and be able to process for energy. So there's two ways really that modification is going to happen. And this is an important aspect when it comes to the rest of what we're going to talk about through this session, because it's a repetitive theme. You have enzymes, and you also have heat. And depending on the type of grain, sometimes those grains like barley will have the enzymes in the grain itself that can be used as a catalyst to help break up the protein net and break down the starch granules into simple sugars. But often you also are going to need heat to help this process along. And so what happens is you have one or the other, and sometimes you might have both. But at the end of the day, we need to actually create a process called gelatinization. So enzymes and heat, often mixed with some water, allow for the breakdown of the starch molecules, and eventually we'll break them apart. So through the process of heat, we start to unravel these granules. And then with enzymes, they actually start to break apart the sugar molecules by basically re-adding water to the system. That water and that heat break up these starch molecules that are essentially long chains of simple sugars that have been consolidated together by the plant, i.e. making starch. And we end up with a simple sugar called glucose. So in the diagram here, we have this process called enzymatic hydrolysis. We have the enzymes hydrolyzing, or adding water back into the system to break apart these sugar molecules and creating simple glucose. And the whole point here is that we need to break apart these large starch chains in and convert them back into a very simple form of sugar, because at the end of the day, we're going to be looking to do fermentation to create alcohol. And the process of fermentation uses yeast. Yeast is a single cell organism. It simply is not big enough to eat or process these these strains of sugar molecules, these multi-strained molecules that are put together. So we need to break them into simple. And this is how beer, malting grains for beer production or for spirits production is done all over the world, not just in Asia or whatnot. So anytime we have grains as part of the process, we do this. If you're familiar with wine production, the sugar that is coming from the grape, which is held within the liquid inside the grape, is already in a simple form of fructose and sucrose and glucose, and it doesn't need to be broken up. It's already in this form. What happens with the grain is it combines all of this stuff together into this larger starch granule as the grain matures in the summertime and heads towards fall or the harvest season, and then allows that plant to basically winter over, and then heat of spring with moisture of spring allows for some of this process to kind of happen and break those sugars down so the plant can use it for energy, or we can use it for fermentation. All right. So basically, like what I just described, is you have Europe and Asia with kind of two different processes here, and this kind of goes through that a little bit. You start with the grain, we malt it, which is the process that we kind of just described, which is having the plant break up the protein molecules, the protein net, and the I don't know why I keep forgetting this term, but it's the starch granules. Starch is the term that I keep forgetting. So basically we go through that process of malting to break up the starch molecules and modify them either through enzymes or heat to release that sugar, and we end up with a mash that we can then strip out the sugar and create a sugary liquid. And the other way, so there's kind of like two ways to do it. You can malt, or you can actually take unmalted grains, such as they do in Ireland a lot, uses unmalted barley. And you can actually apply heat to the grain without malting it, go through the modification process and extract your sugar that way, thus creating a mash, and eventually ending up with a sugary liquid that we can apply yeast to. The yeast is going to eat the sugar, and this is called a liquid state or sequential fermentation, because you are working in sequence from grain to mashing to creating a sugary liquid to fermentation, and the end product is alcoholic liquid of some sort that you can then send on to be distilled. All right, so that's the fermentation process that happens, generally speaking, in most European type productions, where we're starting with grain. In Asia, we have a little bit, oh, I'm sorry. So, oh, no, I'm here. So in Asia, again, we start out with grains, and there's different types of grains sometimes here. The biggest difference often is going to be with rice rather than barley, although barley is kind of used sometimes. But we do have different grains that are processed slightly differently. Often it's going to start with steam that is being added to the grain initially, and that is done in order to really soften up the grain, and eventually will allow for this gelatinization of the material, and eventually the release of the sugar, or the breakdown of those starch molecules into simple sugars. So often what's going to be happening here is you're going to have distiller is going to be adding and using fungal enzymes in order to help process and break down some of the sugars, which we're going to cover in just a minute, as well as yeast. So when these things are added together, what we're talking about now is, instead of a sequential fermentation or process, we're talking about parallel fermentation. And this is often done for a solid or semi-solid state fermentation. So we're going to cover a lot of this in a few minutes and kind of go through it in detail. So don't worry about it if you're not super familiar with it at the moment. The biggest takeaway here is to understand that for most European type productions, including in the Caribbean with sugarcane and Mexico with agave, etc. No matter what your sort of process is, it's almost always going to follow along the sequential line, going from raw material to alcoholic liquid that can then be distilled. In Asia, there's a lot of techniques and traditions that use the parallel fermentation because they're relying on yeast as well as fungi to help process and break down all these grains so that they can be processed out into an alcoholic liquid. So here we have modification, the enzymatic hydrolysis, and alcoholic fermentation happening basically in parallel or at the same time in the same batch. So that's a little bit different, obviously, than what we do in the West. And at the end, the result is essentially the same. You have an alcoholic liquid, or sometimes alcohol that's contained within a solid. Again, we're going to go through this in a few minutes and explain it in more detail. But that is essentially what we end up with, and that can now be sent to distillation. Okay, so let's talk about the fungi. I said we were going to talk about this a second ago, so let's go through this in a little bit of detail. So basically, this is when we take a starchy material such as a grain that has been steamed and gelatinized or softened, and the goal is to soften the starch out. And we're going to apply fungal spores to that, which are going to be spread out. Now, it's important to kind of understand that sometimes this is done with very small portions of the eventual grain batch, or it can be applied to the entire batch. And we're going to go through some of those differences when we get to the specific categories. But in any event, fungal spores are spread over the batch of grains that have been gelatinized or softened and heated. So you've applied heat and moisture, and the fungi grow into the material. And when I say grow, they're really sending filaments down into the material. And you can look at the screen in front of you, that solid line through the middle is essentially the, let's consider that the outer shell of the grain, whatever it might be, that's been softened up, and it allows for that fungi to soak in. And what's going to happen is the fungi is going to release enzymes, amylases, which are going to help kind of break down the material that is there. And you're going to end up with enzymatic activity that's going to cause the starches to be converted into simple sugars. It's essentially just going to be doing that enzymatic hydrolysis by breaking down the starches into simple sugars by adding liquid. And an enzyme is a catalyst. It helps another reaction happen. So it doesn't involve or interject itself into the flavor or anything. It's really there to kind of help that process happen. So really what it does is it introduces water into the starch and breaks apart those molecules. And then the net result is that you end up with sugar and some other nutrients being absorbed by the fungi to help it kind of grow and keep reproducing. So the sort of I always like to double check my bullet points here. So basically, once you have the sugar and other nutrients that are produced and absorbed by the fungi, essentially what happens is they're going to cool a lot of this down and essentially dry it out. And now what you have is a sugary material that can be used. It can be mixed with other material or whatnot, and essentially be ready for fermentation. And we're going to talk about the differences in those and where they come from in a little bit. So when the enzyme-rich material is mixed with other gelatinized starch material, the enzymes undertake both modification, if the greens are being used, and enzymatic hydrolysis. So depending on which way the process is and which type of category we're working on, there's definitely a difference in what the end result will be and where it's going to be going. So it's kind of interesting, and it's kind of a cool process once you sort of understand it, because they're really just using fungi to kind of help move this along rather than using the malting process that we use in the West a lot.
Hey, Brian, quick
Yeah,
question.
please.
Are these any like specific fungi spores? Like, are they a specific mushroom, or is there any sort of, I guess, difference in variations in fungi that affect the process?
That's a good question. I don't know the specific names, and quite honestly, they don't really go into the specifics here. Depending on which country you're in, and really the kind of classic example that we use a lot is Japan, with the production of koji, because that's essentially what's happening here. They do have kind of regional fungi, but there's fungi that grow all around us. The fungi itself sometimes, but most often doesn't really involve adding a lot of flavor. It's really the catalyst that is creating the transition from one form to another. So while they have cultivated certain strains over the years, these are definitely things that have been it's kind of like yeast strains in the West where we've isolated certain yeast strains. I don't know the scientific name for these fungi, but I'm sure they're getting them commercially, and they're using them, especially in the larger operations, to add to them the way a brew house or a distillery or winery would actually buy yeast strains from their sourcing. It's hard to kind of cultivate this stuff over time unless you're in continuous production, and a lot of, like, especially traditional sake production is seasonal, so there's not often this continuation. It's not like you're making sourdough bread where you can kind of hold a starter over and use it again and again. Sometimes you can. Certainly we have examples of that with sour mash whiskeys, for instance, and certainly in rum production, there are essentially like a almost like a starter or a carryover, but a lot of times those are going to be yeasts that are held in traditional wood tanks or things like that. I don't really have a good answer for you as far as the specific names or scientific names, categories of these fungi. We can certainly look into that, and maybe I'll try to see if there's an answer. There's nothing in the material that I've been aware of that talks about the specifics, though.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, obviously, just from rum, even just being, wild fermentation versus commercial, I didn't know if that had like played a factor in Asian
I
production.
think yeah, I think even, well, whether it's rum, wine, beer, whatever it might be, I think the use of wild yeast or wild fungi is is done, and certainly there are producers out there that will do that. The reliability of some of those things is not necessarily always there, so sometimes it's especially if you scale a little bit in production, it's hard to kind of rely on those things to always get to the alcohol strength you need or to always create the fermentation. So I think most producers are going to rely, at least to a certain extent, on um, commercial yeast strains and fungi strains and whatnot to kind of make sure that their process goes along smoothly. So, but I'll look into it and I'll see if I can post an answer about that later on.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. All right, so just kind of keep it going through here. Asia, traditions and an overview of fungi. This might actually answer a little bit of your question, but not really. It says it right here. The distiller cultivated fungal enzymes. So they're kind of carrying over their own kind of stuff. If you have a smaller producer, large batch type producers are going to do things slightly differently. But really the difference is on this page, you have, let's see here, we have, I just want to make sure I explain it correctly. Okay. All right. So this is basically what this is saying is, depending on the size of your production, essentially, what you're going to be doing is actually either in a small batch distillery cultivating maybe your own fungal enzymes, as well as your yeast, or adding them in together. And that is a slower process. But if you're and really what they're doing is they're adding all of this material to a very small percentage of the grain material that eventually will be used. And it's essentially creating a starter. It's kind of the way sake is produced, with in a lot of cases with a small percentage of the rice that gets essentially started with introduction to the fungal enzymes, creating the koji that is going to help kind of move this process along. And essentially what they're doing is they're not adding all of it at once to a huge batch of grain, and because it doesn't all go quick enough through the process, and so you don't maybe use up all the sugar or whatnot. So they just start with a small batch, and then slowly will add that small batch to the larger batch of grains that have not been introduced to the yeast and to the fungi, in order to then mix that throughout the entire batch and get a better set and a quicker result. We're going to talk about this in a little bit, but sometimes there's a reason for this, in the respect that if you're in a warm area, you don't want a very slow fermentation, because that could lead to rotting of your product before it actually ferments, and funky flavors and things like that, versus being in a cooler area where your process isn't going to go quite as fast. You're less susceptible, especially if it's less humidity, natural humidity, you're going to be less susceptible to rot and whatnot. So they may do a large batch type of product, but often they're going to have to break that down a little bit, not allowing the koji to kind of do its job, but using steam to actually gelatinize things. So there's actually a little series of parts to this. So on the, let's see. So small batch starchy material, you add fungi to it, enzymes are released, you end up with koji, chu, or nuruk. So that's the Japanese, the Chinese, and I believe the Korean terms for essentially the same thing, and that's essentially your starter grain material that has had the beginning of a breakdown of the material through the introduction of the fungi, and then that is added to the larger batch, which then you have your parallel fermentation, because you've added at some point some yeast into that as well, either into the primary starter batch or into the main batch, and you end up with your parallel fermentation happening there, where modification, hydrolysis, and fermentation happen, resulting in an alcoholic liquid or solid at the end. The other way, well, they kind of do this weird, it's kind of backwards, because in the large batch stuff, you can actually just introduce everything, steam it, it all goes into the big batch, and sometimes is introduced or incorporated with that starter batch, sometimes not. You end up with the same result though. Okay. So here we're going to talk about the liquid state, semi-solid, and then we'll talk about solid afterwards. So there's a little bit of a difference of how things are handled here, and a lot of this is very traditional types of production that go back for hundreds, if not thousands of years, with sometimes little modification. So when we talk about the difference between a liquid state, when we have a batch of grape juice that we're intending to make wine, or a sugary liquid that in the beer world we call a wort, where we've already gone through the process and extracted the sugars from the grains, or we've in the production of rum, for instance, you might have sugarcane juice that's been incorporated with some water, perhaps to dilute it a bit. Whatever you have a liquid that's ready for basically fermentation, and this can be kind of any raw material, and it's going to essentially be ready to go through the sequential fermentation process that we described earlier. When you have a solid or semi-solid state type of material, this is where we have the grains incorporated into liquid, and it's not quite a clear liquid. So this is where we have starch material that is going through a parallel fermentation, and it's kind of looks like a porridge. In fact, there's a picture here. So this is rice that is mixed with some liquid, but it has both the enzymatic hydrolysis as well as the fermentation going on at the same time, typically. And so you have all of the grains in the liquid kind of going through the breaking down process, the starch conversion, which is the modification, into simple sugars, and then fermentation, all kind of happening at once. So it's just sort of consolidated into one batch, and that's kind of how it happens. So there's a definite need to understand the difference here. So in sequential fermentation, all the sugars present at the start of fermentation. Any raw material can be used for sequential fermentation. The yeast divide up and fill the volume of the liquid. At peak, there's typically about 100 million yeast per 1 milliliter of liquid. So there's literally billions of yeast cells in there. And the cells can also be moved around due to stirring and agitation or convection currents with heat. They don't need to be moved around to reach all of the sugar, and their population growth means that they would reach all parts of the liquid regardless. Okay, so that's an important distinction here. Only starchy raw material can be used to conduct a solid state fermentation. In this type of ferment, there is still a flowing liquid, but it is full of small lumps of the raw material, as kind of talked about. And it's important to realize that this is not necessarily just grains. There's also, we're going to talk about productions that use things like potatoes, sweet potatoes, and whatnot. Oh, did I lose you there for a minute?
Sorry, yeah, for some reason I just got kicked out, but a wreck.
Okay. Um, I don't know where you dropped off, but how far along was I? Was I talking about this slide here?
Yep, we were on the slides. It was only like 20 seconds, maybe.
Okay. All right. So I was just talking about the semi-solid. I think the thing that I was trying to just make sure is understood is that in a semi-solid, we're talking about different grains and whatnot, but it also could be potato, sweet potato, and things like that. So it's not necessarily always just a grain like rice, because they do use sugars from a lot of different sources when they're producing sochu and whatnot. So it's important. Regardless, you have some liquid. Uh, Typically, this is, like I said, going to be a parallel fermentation happening. So you have a need really to kind of get the liquid's not flowing freely necessarily through this all the time. So you do have to stir it, and you have to make sure that you keep it moving with some sort of agitation or whatnot. So that you can get everything done and you can get the hydrolysis done and break down the sugars and allow that to go for fermentation. So it is a little bit more of a hands-on type of process. And we showed you the picture there. So the third part is, the third type of category that we have here is actually a solid state fermentation. And this is when we have a starchy material. There's not a lot of liquid. In fact, the liquid that is produced in this type of process really results in the breaking down of the cells here. And then we'll talk about this when we get to traditional sochu banking. But it's really no free flowing liquid. Now there is moisture here, because often there's a little bit. I mean, these types of fermentations are actually usually put into pits in the ground. So there might be, how a compost pile is always going to be moist. Really, it just kind of comes from the breaking down of the cell walls of all the starchy material. It's the same thing that's happening here. So while it's not dry, there's also not a lot, if any, of free flowing liquid. So it's a little bit of a different process, and you can only use starchy material in this type of process. Once the grains are buried in a pit, the fungi and other microorganisms grow through the material, breaking down the starch material and eating it as they go. Typically, this is a very slow process, often taking months at a time, which we're going to go through some diagrams in a minute, show you that. During the fermentation process, the grains break down, and whatever liquid there is going to flow to the bottom, but it's typically not going to be like a lot of liquid. And as I said, it kind of can be compared to a compost pile. So those are the three types of states or categories of fermentation that we sort of look at and address in here. And you'll see them all kind of being used. Most of what we're talking about in Asia is going to be semi-solid or solid, though. Okay. Any questions on that?
Nope, good.
Okay, so here's a picture of, if you tell me exactly what it is. This is slide 9. This is grains being loaded into a ferment pit in China, and like I said, they are kind of dug into the ground. Helps insulate, obviously, and it creates an environment where they can go through and break down the material here. All right.
Does the solid state have to be like in motion as the liquid state, or no?
Well,
Like,
we have a whole section on that where we're going to kind of talk about how it's not really motion. like you would experience in a tank of liquid, but the time frame is extended over months, and there's a rotation. Um, it's not really like a stirring of the pit, but there's a rotation of the material within layers of the pit, and we're going to go through that in a minute. I don't want to. I know I keep saying we're going to cover it, but we're going to explain this in more detail. This is a lot of setup just to kind of help you understand what we're going to talk about in the next few minutes. So right now we're going to go through some solid state fermentation details and kind of look at some examples of specific categories that it might apply to. So hold on for a second, and we'll get there, I think. So the first one we're going to talk about is sochu. It's important to understand that a lot of times in Asian, if you know how to pronounce Asian words and whatnot, that's great. It's a little different than what we do here in the United States or in the West. And a lot of times the oo and oo sounds are much more truncated. Like we say chew, and our mouths literally kind of move from one sort of vowel sound to another as we close them. A lot of times in Chinese or Japanese, the u sound is really truncated and demarcated, and we'll go through that when I talk about chu in a minute. But sochu is another example. It's not so chu, it's sochu, and it's kind of like the same as you would apply to sake, which is not sake as a pronunciation. So just little distinctions there to help you maybe be a little more accurate in your professionalism, I guess. That's what I try to achieve, at least. So anyways, so koji is preparing our rice grains and getting them so that they are going to be ready for eventually helping to break down the rice and get it ready for fermentation into whatever form it's going to be. So we start with rice grains, and it's important to understand that rice grains need to be polished. We need to take the outside of those rice kernels off a little bit because they're very thick and they're dense, and they also contain a lot of sulfur, which is not good for distillation. And when you look at a lot of Asian stills, often there's not a lot of copper used in Asian spirit distillation. They're going to be stainless steel tanks, and so the process where you end up with sulfur interacting with copper, such as in Scotch whiskey production and whatnot, does not really get a chance to happen. And so it's important to kind of make sure that we're sort of taking advantage or making ourselves aware of that when we're producing these, and either removing the outside of the grain at the beginning, or doing something during the production process to help kind of mitigate the impact of sulfur. But in sake production, it's often common to mill the rice grains down and polish them so that there's a smaller percentage of the actual grain versus the core, which is where the sugar is going to be, and it allows the enzymes, or allows the fungi to work quicker, and also not impart as much kind of flavor into sake. When we're making distilled spirits, it's a little less important, but the goal really here is to remove, like I said, the sulfur. So basically what happens is they polish the grains down, then they wash that material, they soak it to soften it up, essentially basically gelatinizing it, and then apply steam, which is going to help further create a soft medium for our fungi to be able to get access through. And then we're adding the spores. That does its job, and the enzymes help to kind of break down the materials we described earlier, and through modification and some hydrolysis, and you end up with koji. And there's sort of different kinds of koji. At the end of the day, there's not a lot of, as I said before, not a lot of flavor differences, although the black koji is something that's a little bit kind of sought after for certain types of products. And it's only for a couple different things, which I'll cover in a sec. The types and effect on style is not something that you really kind of need to know, though. It is just important, maybe a little bit in the respect that the black koji produces a lot of extra acid, and from a regional point of view, it's that could come into play. So we're going to talk about that in a second. So fermenting in
Brian, sorry,
yeah.
can I interject for a second? Do you mind going back? So I'm assuming like our everyday rice, let's say jasmine rice that we eat is all polished,
It
right?
is. Yeah, yeah. So if you go back and look at these, you don't get, you're not getting grain in that, when you buy jasmine or basmati rice or whatnot, you're not getting it like this. So the husk is always removed. Although for food production, they're not necessarily worried about polishing these rice grains down to such a small level
Mhm.
when they're making sake or they're working on making sochu and whatnot. There is an effort to polish these down because it shortens the process. Now the problem with like sake production is the more you polish, the less you have, and so the less ability
Right.
you're going to have to make volume. But the more polished you go, with the rice grain, the less impurities and flavor you have. So it kind of works in an inverse relationship where the more you polish it, the more refined or subtle your sake is going to be. We're not really worried about that so much when we're making distilled spirits because a lot of that flavor gets left behind. Although, they really are just basically kind of concerned with the starch in the core of the rice grain. They balance it out based on how much energy they want to expend and time they want to expend in the polishing process versus the net end result of how much you end up with at the end. So it's really just grabbing the sugar that's inside that rice grain that's really kind of key.
Is there a certain standard for the type of rice? I mean, because obviously at the store there's sushi rice, jasmine, there's a lot of different kinds of
Yeah.
rice and they have different components and shapes. Is that a factor that's looked at?
Sure. So I think it's a little bit more relevant when we're talking about sake production, which is not part of this course, obviously. I think because we're dealing with a distilled product, the type of rice is a little less important when you're making spirit. As I said, because you do go through that distillation process. Of course, someone is going to claim that their rice is better for certain things, just the way they claim that certain grains or sugar canes or agave are better for certain things. At the end of the day, though, you're not really, unless you're doing a very artisanal type of distillation, which some do, you're not necessarily relying so much on the taste profile or the aromatic profile of the raw material, because a lot of this production with sochu ends up, quite honestly, as high proof spirit that just is fairly neutral. So I'm sure there are definitely examples, particularly in the artisan side, which we'll talk about at the very end of this presentation, where yeah, some rice grains, some rice types might be important, but I think it's more relevant to sake production than it is to spirits production. Um, Nobody ever has discussed with me using a specific type of, it's kind of like, in the wine world we have different grapes that produce different flavor profiles, obviously. You don't have that kind of conversation when it comes to sochu and whatnot. Although I will say I'm not a super expert, and so I'm sure somebody might disagree with me, and there might be some examples of that. I think within the context of WCT and your need to know knowledge, um, that doesn't really get covered too much. So I don't want to shortchange the answer on you, but I don't think it's something that we cover
Yeah, no,
too deeply here. But yeah, it's a good question.
okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure. All right. So, and just the last point, I made this a second ago, but I think we're going to come back to this in a minute. But the black koji is important because it does actually produce a little higher acid level. And so where black koji is important from a geographical point of view, that comes into play a little bit because it helps raise the acid of the material or of the batches that are being produced. But generally speaking, yellow and white koji, this kind of goes into your question about what kind of molds might be used, what kind of fungi might be used, and they do have differences. I think it's more kind of a regional thing, and or what they're cultivating or buying. But I don't think it's something that really is going to impart a lot of flavor. It's just that there is a discussion in here about black koji increasing the acid within the batch. And so that comes into relevance, especially if you're in a hotter climate, because you want a higher pH or a lower pH in order to kind of battle other bacterias and things like that. So we'll get there in a second. All right, fermentation batches. So there's two different types here, and this is something that, again, you don't need to know this in massive detail, but I know that you are going to want to know that because this very well could be a multiple choice question. That the awamori is a one-step type of fermentation process, and then most other things are done in a two-step process, and this is how they look when you set them up side by side. So basically what's happening here is you have all of the ingredients together, and this goes back to what I was saying a second ago, where you might have a small amount of the raw material that gets introduced to koji and water. It essentially becomes a starter, and then once that gets going, you're going to add it to the entire batch. In this case, all of it gets added together. You have the koji that goes in with the water, the yeast, and then you end up with a fermentation that results in ABV of somewhere between 14 and 20%, fairly high when it comes to comparing it to, say, wine or certainly beer that might be destined for distillation into whiskeys and whatnot. Then you have the koji and the yeast, and this is kind of the starter process, where you have two steps. You're adding the koji and the water to a relatively small portion of the entire batch, usually a third to even a fifth of the total batch. And then the remainder has heat and steam applied to it in order to gelatinize it, soften it up. And then that koji is then added to it, or I'm sorry, the starter batch with the koji is then added to it and incorporated in there, and you end up with, again, an alcoholic fermentation. And so we're going to talk about geography in a second and the differences there, but this does come into play. And as I said, often it's because you want to move the process along fairly quickly and make it happen. It's also a much smaller type of production. So on the top with the awamori, you typically have relatively small, almost craft type producers, and on the bottom you actually have almost everybody else, which is the larger volume type producers. So they just kind of have a continuous process where they're creating koji, water, yeast together, and then adding it to larger batches as a starter to get things going. At the end of the day, you end up with, it's also used to incorporate. So here's another point: is the starter type of the portion of the batch is often going to be rice, but the material that's in the rest of the batch could be other types of starchy material, such as potatoes or whatnot. So it really kind of depends on the type of sochu that you're actually producing, which will define what that end product is. All right, that makes sense. Remember awamori, that's kind of an important term in there. All right, so distillation and maturation. Yep. So distillation can be done in column stills and pot stills. For the most part, when it's done in a column still, it's called sochu. When it's done in some other form, you have a definition or a defining term that's attached to it. So hankaku is one, and awamori, like we just talked about, is another. These are all sort of like, think about these as like specialty, geographically designated type products, the awamori and the hankaku, either by raw material or geography, I guess is the better way to say it. But the large volume production is basically just sochu. Some other things, and this is something that kind of comes up, this vacuum type of process. It's covered very lightly in the material, but and it's kind of in relation sometimes to other sections within the book. But you do want to kind of make note of the fact that sometimes a vacuum type of distillation is going to happen. And essentially what you're doing is you are creating a vacuum or a partial vacuum. You're reducing the atmospheric pressure that's applied to the product. And essentially it lowers the boiling point of the product so that you can work with delicate material at a lower temperature in order to get boil, which is what you need to extract the alcohol from it. So you're not cooking the raw material quite as intensely because you're doing everything at a lower temperature under vacuum. Vacuum distillation is a very expensive process. The machines are very complicated. It is used, but it is not super common. And it's almost always going to be used when you're using very delicate type products. Um, More commonly, you have steam that's either injected or done as a coil, kind of like traditional pot stills that we would see in other parts of the world. So just remember, there's often going to be, just like everywhere else, column still distillation that's going to be used for high volume stuff, and pot still distillation that's going to be used for very, kind of craft oriented or smaller production stuff. And again, the difference being, from a flavor point of view, column stills are often going to produce lighter, higher ABV type spirits that have less flavor. Pot stills are used for producing more lower alcohol, lower ABV, but more robustly flavored types of end products that retain a little bit more of their raw material kind of flavors. And then, as far as maturation goes, this is something that is, we don't really see. They have different kinds of wood and different kinds of processes in Asia than we see in the West traditionally. They don't really use the oak barrels like we see so commonly in whiskey and rum and tequila productions. Often you're going to see unglazed earthenware pots. This kind of goes back to the discussion we had a minute ago about managing sulfur. So this is another way that sulfur can be mitigated, because the clay pots, the earthenware pots, will actually help the sulfur migrate out of the material, and it really can be a good, done to a good advantage in helping to mitigate that if you're using stainless steel distillation tanks, pot stills. And you can also open up a earthenware pot and literally skim off the heavier group 3 fractions, and thus change the flavor profile of your product if you want. Yeah, that's it. Any questions on that section?
Nope, all good.
Okay, so the next one really just kind of talks about raw materials and sort of the differences. And again, you're not going to see a lot of these. You're not going to see a lot of these questions on the exam, but it is important to maybe understand a little bit of the differences. So we go through this. The important parts is that malted grains cannot be used. Grain or potato koji must be used all the way through for making hankaku shochu and awamori. And awamori always must use that one-step fermentation that we just talked about. And for both of them, single pot still distillation is mandatory. So depending on what you start with raw material, sweet potatoes, barley, short grain rice, or long grain rice. And remember that starter percentage is almost always going to be rice, and then it's going to be incorporated with the sweet potato, the barley, or the different rice types. You are going to end up with, and then there's sake lees and brown sugar that are sometimes used. So sake lees, when they make sake, there's rice that is fermented, and there's a lot of actual water that's added to it in order to have a liquid substance. When you rack essentially the liquid off of the rice grains, you still have rice grains that will have some type, they'll have some sugar left in them, and they're just going to kind of use them. You don't get a lot of, like, it's not really used for high quality sochu. It's just kind of mentioned here as a specialty type product. You can also use brown sugar, which again is going to have a different effect and a different flavor profile. It's kind of I think it's used for slightly smaller, it's really limited in production, but they do use it sometimes. These names are fun because they're not necessarily part of our common language, unless you are familiar with Asian, but the types are kind of important to understand and to know a little bit, especially the first 4. So the sweet potato is imo, barley becomes mugai, short grain rice is kom-e, and long grain rice is the awamori. And then the sake lees is sake kashu, and brown sugar is kokuto. The first 4 are really the most important ones. And again, you have a few other names here that you have to kind of work through a little bit. It's this is where flashcards kind of come in handy. And again, you're not going to have a ton of questions on this, but having a little bit of a base knowledge of these is kind of important. So sweet potato becomes imo, and that's satsuma sochu. Barley is mujai, iki sochu. Short grain rice is kome, which is kuma sochu, and then the awamori becomes ryakuku awamori. All right, a whole bunch of fun terms there to kind of remember. But I think the like I said, the use of flashcards is really the best way to kind of get through that. All right, let's look at a little bit of geography real quick. This doesn't go on too long. So Kyushu, this is really just to kind of give you a little context here. As a way of comparison, the latitude change from the most northerly to the most southerly part of Japan is similar to the change in the east coast of the United States from northern Maine to the southern tip of Florida. So if you go to the very top of Japan, we're talking several thousand miles of difference. This is Russia here essentially, and you're very close up here to cool water at least, just like you are in Maine. And then way down the bottom here, which is at the end of the Ryukyu Islands, Japan actually goes almost all the way to Taiwan, and it's tropical down here. So big, huge difference in latitude. You know, we're at 42, 43 degrees up here, and down here you're like at 22 or 23. So it's a huge change in temperature and climate. That's something that's important to understand. So this is Kyushu. This is an area where just want to make sure I get this correct for you. This is the head of this is kind of like where the main sochu production is done. And this is where the Iki Islands and Kuma are the GIs. Are they marked on here? So Ryukyu, Okinawa Prefecture. This is actually where most of or all of the awamori is produced. They don't do this very well in the book here as I go along.
Did you ever see Karate Kid, Brian?
Many times.
I know the Okinawa Islands from that movie.
Yeah, totally. So this is what the book says. Iki Islands, which is what we're looking at here. So this is how it works. So go back here. So Kyushu is where the Iki Islands are essentially, and Kuma. These are actual GIs. So they have geographical indicators for the sochu here. Satsuma sochu comes from Kokushima Prefecture, with the exception of the Amari Islands. Again, you don't need to know a lot of this. You just need to be familiar a little bit with, like, awamori comes from Okinawa. So these are GIs. These are basically, like, you know, places that will come up on some small types of production. Kokutu Shoshu comes from the Amami Islands, but it is not a GI. And then awamori comes from Okinawa Prefecture. All right, got all that? It's, again, you don't need to know this like super intensely. I would say the thing to be knowledgeable of is awamori comes from Okinawa. It's a single chain process of production, and is always done in pot stills. That's the best advice I think I can give, because I think that one comes up most often on some exams.
Okay.
All right, we're not going to taste anything today, but we are going to move on to Baiju. All right, so that's a nice picture of a warehouse that has, this is slide 18. These are sealed fermentation pits in China. All right, so these are pits. These actually go down into the ground, and we are going to get into how chu is produced, which is kind of key to all of this. And really what chu is it is creating a substance that's ready for fermentation. All right, so it's a process where the sugars are consolidated into. All right, and you can see that they're sealed under plastic. They're in the ground, and they sit here under climate control conditions for months, literally. And it's really kind of a crazy process that has been, you know, perfected for 1,000 years. All right, so the difference between big chu, small chu, and brand chu is that you have big chu that starts out with wheat or wheat and pea. And when they say pea, I think they really mean sorghum. I don't really think it's actual like green peas like we talk about. I just want to make sure I tell you the right thing. Okay. So I think part of like what's described here in the context of the material can kind of be related a little bit to rum production in the respect that what they're kind of going for here is a process that actually uses enzymes with bacteria and yeast, which are going to be supplied by the chew that's essentially aging in the ground, and this is going to kind of build flavor essentially, and it's kind of the way like Jamaican rums use the muck pits and whatnot to create bacteria and acidity and add more flavor depth to the products that they're eventually going to be producing. So it's a little bit of a correlation there, maybe. And so here with the Big Chew, as I said, they start with wheat or pea that is crushed, it's soaked and shaped into bricks. And the Big Chew, literally, we'll show you a picture of this in a second. It's literally a bigger brick. And then you have the smaller ones, which usually are relying on rice as the base. The rice has to be polished first, but then it's crushed, it's soaked, shaped into the balls. And that's where we have that modification, gelatinization, and enzyme release. And you have small chew. In both cases, like right across the middle there, you have the same sort of steps where the fungi, the yeast, and the bacteria are added. And the net result is, I want to show it to you right here. So there's literally a large or big chew, which is the big brick, and you have the small balls, which are the small chew. All right. The third one is the bran chew, which literally starts with bran, which really relies on the outside of the grains, which is what bran really is. And bran chew is more like koji in that steaming is used to kind of break down the sugars in it, and then it's seeded with fungi and bacteria. It does not provide the fermentation with yeast. They need to be added. So sometimes you have yeast that are going to be incorporated into the Big Chew and the small chew, that kind of gets carried along with it, and that will provide yeast for fermentation. The bran chew does not. It's really just filler. And then when these things are ready to be used, they get crushed up and mixed thoroughly with the grains that are going to be put into the fermentation vessels, and then move on. And so you can actually see a fermentation vessel here, and it's a solid state fermentation that is happening in this process. That cap would go on it, and it would be allowed to ferment for a period of time. We're going to show you a diagram of that in just a second, but this is essentially, a fermentation tank, really, that allows for alcohol to be produced in a larger context and then stripped away. So the traditional Baiju still, that's actually a still, I'm sorry, that's not a fermentation tank. It's already gone through that. So the still is fairly similar shape to a pot still that we would see in the West, although you can see that it's made from stainless steel. It's not copper, as we talked about, and the grains go into that still along with the husks that come from the raw material. A lot of times that's added in here kind of the way we might put they'll put like rice husks in beer when it's being produced in order to allow for really just kind of like channels for the liquid to run through. In this case, you are actually putting the husks in to allow for channels for the steam to be able to migrate through this solid mass of material. So that all goes in there, and then steam is actually often injected. And that steam rising up through the tank is going to essentially do the same thing as boiling the liquid, which is going to strip the alcohol out of the fermented material and carry it up through the line arm and out as new spirit. So all that solid material gets left behind, and sometimes it gets reincorporated into another process or another fermentation and another distillation, but some of it might be discarded as well, depending on where we are and what type of product we're making. It is important to understand rectification. If you've gone through the still types for other materials, such as whiskey and whatnot, you'll know that the taller the still, the more rectification and reflux you're going to have. We don't really have reflux. We talked about that with um, the sulfur compounds here, and not having copper stills. We have stainless steel, so you don't really have that happening here. But the height of that still is definitely going to make a difference, because the taller your still, the cooler the product is at the top, and you're going to have lighter alcohols moving out and the heavier alcohols remaining inside the still. So depending on the type of product you're making, it really is kind of important to understand that there's going to be a difference in the product that comes out at the end based on your still height and whatnot. During a lot of this fermentation, and what makes up, I'm going to go back here just a second, what makes up this mass is not just this stuff, but a lot of times they're going to actually put raw grains in here that have not gone through the process of fermentation. And in traditional production, that is a way to actually heat up and add moisture to the raw grains, and in effect gelatinize the grains. And when we get in a minute over to the process of making the different baijus, you will see that there's a rotation process of these grains through the system, and this is how they actually use the energy that's used to create the steam and whatnot to help gelatinize and incorporate that into the material. So that's an important step to kind of just remember there for a minute. All right. So the grains are either discarded or they're used again, as I mentioned a second ago, depending on what you're making and what category you're making and what your process is. And then, as I said, new grains can kind of be incorporated into this, and that steam is going to help do some gelatinization. So I kind of skipped ahead there a little bit. All right, so now we're going to go through the different types of baiju real quick. And again, you don't really need to know a lot. I think these four are the ones you really should sort of have a knowledge of, just in the fact that they are what they are. We're going to go through them a little bit in a second. But strong aroma, sauce aroma, light aroma, and rice aroma. So that's all fun. On the other side of the page here, you have all the other ones: Phoenix, Sesame, Lao Bagan, Chi, Mixed, Special, Extra Strong, and Medicine. I don't really think you need to spend a ton of time actually learning this. Just kind of be familiar with the fact that they exist. Other than that, there's not a lot to know here. You may get a question or two that comes up around that. I think more likely it's going to be something related to strong, sauce, light, or rice, because they do go into detail with that. So geographically speaking, strong aroma baiju is produced in a sort of never-ending cycle, which we're going to go through in just a sec. And you have essentially either 100% sorghum or a mix of grains with rice, corn, or wheat. The chew is going to be big chew, and you always have solid state fermentation in pits, traditional baiju still, and the key area of production is Sichuan, all right, the heart of China. So this is the process, and this is where folks get confused. If you look in your book, in your textbook, I don't know why WSET does this, but if you look in the textbook, it should be page 118. On the diagram, on the PowerPoint that we're working with, there's 4 tiers or 4 levels. In the book, it's 5. It's just important to kind of understand that there is a little bit of a difference between the book and the PowerPoint for some reason. I don't really understand why. Either method is fine. It's just it's literally adding an extra layer, but that's totally fine. So the way this works is you have one of those pits, and they literally will remove layers from the pit into piles, and then those piles are going to be mixed with fresh grains or bran. At least the first 2 are. the lower tiers, and these are the ones that are going to contain the most moisture and have not been processed the most. So if you go back here just a second, you'll see that this tier comes from the bottom. Because it's at the bottom, it's going to have collected the most moisture. It's also technically the least processed out of this group within the pit, because they do actually mix these layers. And the ones on the left, the lighter colored ones, are the most processed, and they don't have new grains added to them, because they're going to be ejected from the system once they go through distillation. So they're prepared for distillation. And as I said a few minutes ago, fresh grains sometimes are added depending on where you are in that distillation process. And it's a way to introduce heat and moisture to the grains that have not been gelatinized yet. So they go into the stills, and the top tier, once it's distilled, you have spirit number 1. That spirit is discarded. I'm sorry, that grain is discarded because it's been used the most and it's the driest. The second tier, you have spirit number 2, and sometimes that is ejected, but more often it's actually going to be reincorporated with fresh chew and reprocessed through the system. Number 3, you have number 3 spirit. Again, you have fresh chew added to that. Spirit number 4 comes from the lowest tier. Fresh chew is added to that. So going back all the way to the beginning, to the bottom pit on the left-hand side, just remember that there were 4 tiers here. Now we have 1 tier that's been discarded with 3 new tiers. Those 3 tiers are then placed back into a pit. And you'll say, well, there's only 3 tiers, but we had 4 before. Well, we took one of the tiers out of the system that left lower volume, that is made up by the fresh chew that is added. Technically, we have 3 tiers because that's what was left out of the 3 piles that were remaining. Eventually, when they are going to take that out again, they will create 4 tiers out of that once it comes through and it's gone through fermentation and has been being ready for the next series of distillations. And this literally is a process that will take months in the pits. And it's a slow process, kind of like composting. It doesn't happen overnight, but if you leave your pile and make sure it's still moist and everything, it will eventually go from lawn and kitchen scraps back into basically topsoil. And that's kind of what's happening here. It's a controlled part of that, version of that process. But essentially what they're doing is they're only making sure that there are certain types of bacteria and yeast that are incorporated here to make sure that the end result is kind of where they want. But at the end of the day, you're getting alcohol being produced in a solid state fermentation that takes a while, and it creates a sort of layered level of flavor that is desirable. All right. So I kind of like, that's an easier way to go through this process a little bit, but the step-by-step on the PowerPoint. I kind of almost like the book a little bit because it sort of, while it doesn't go through the step-by-step part in the PowerPoint, it does outline it very well. So whichever one you kind of rely on, again, you just really sort of need to know that there's essentially a rotation where fresh chew is added to used grains that have gone through fermentation to kind of help reinvigorate them with fresh product. And eventually the top layer becomes the driest layer. It has the least amount of alcohol in it. It's been used the most, and it eventually gets ejected from the system. Any questions on that? Any questions on that? You got all that?
For the most part.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at it, just like the first time I looked at this, I'm like, what the heck is going on here? It's just a bunch of arrows going around and around. But when you kind of take a look at how the process works, you kind of have this slow, steady movement of product that rotates certain product out, and you refill it with fresh product, and it just kind of continues on its own, almost without stopping. So it's kind of cool, and it's literally kind of done and perfected for 1,000 years, like I said before. So pretty interesting. Sauce aroma Baiju has an 8-stage linear process. So that's different than the circular sort of process that we just talked about. And the raw material here is sorghum, uses high temperature big chew. The fermentation is solid state, again done in pits with traditional baijiu stills, and it comes from the center region of China called Guizhou, and it's a little bit of a warmer area, hence the higher temperature, and you're sort of heading closer to like the tropical areas, so they don't just the climate is a little bit warmer. That's why the temperature tends to be hotter. I think it happens a little quicker also because of that. Light aroma baijiu has various types of raw materials. They use either big chew or small chew. Fermentation happens also in solid state, but often can happen in pottery vessels rather than in the ground. And there's kind of a reason for this. And again, it's just traditional baijiu stills, but it's in the Northeast as well as in Taiwan, which are essentially tropical climates. So sometimes it becomes a little bit challenging, especially in Taiwan, to use the pits in the ground. So they'll use traditional pottery vessels or large clay vessels instead, and they kind of get the same effect. So it's a manual process. It's a little challenging, but it's kind of cool. Much smaller amounts of light aroma baijiu are made. And then you have rice aroma, which comes from Guangdong. And this is always going to use small chew, which is really just made from rice. Fermentation is in a semi-solid state. So if you kind of go back to that picture of like the cream of wheat sort of picture, that's what we were looking at really from a fermentation point of view. And you have various distillation types, not in traditional baijiu stills. This is often done in a much higher volume type of kind of scenario from Guangxi and Guangdong, and it's just large production kind of stuff, and produces nice but relatively inexpensive and not very flavorful type of product. But kind of interesting. All right. The last one we're going to talk about is soju. And soju, well, this picture, first of all, is a picture of traditional baijiu stills. So these are stills. I don't know if you've gotten into your book too much and gotten to the mezcal section, but these stills actually are very similar to the artisan stills that are used in mezcal production. Almost identical, and there's a lot of like head scratching that goes on because these stills are actually so similar. It's like, how did they come about like this? And you can see that they're relatively small. They have a small pot, and there's water that actually is flowed in at the top, in the pan on the top, and that acts as the cooling / condenser, where the hole in the middle here, so you have your pot, it's heated, the liquid steam rises up into here, it hits the cold water that's continuously being flushed on this pot, and it condenses here down the sides and eventually rolls out effectively the linarm, I guess, into a collecting vessel. So really small production, very traditional. This is how stuff was done for 1,000 years, up until modern technology where we can use, stainless steel pots and tanks and things like that. So really interesting. But when you get to mezcal, just note that you'll see pictures of very similar types of stills there too. All right. So diluted soju is the right page here is basically they start with a highly rectified spirit. It's kind of a weird product. So you don't really need to know a ton of this. What you really need to know is what's on these pages here, and it's just a small amount. So diluted soju dominates production and is in effect flavored vodka. It's just kind of really rectified to such a high degree that there's not a ton of flavor here. And really the only difference between the brands comes from whatever they're going to flavor it with, really. It's kind of like what we would look at as flavored vodkas essentially in our market. It's kind of a smallish part of the industry. It's not really something that we see a ton of, but it is out there, and it's sort of something you need to know of. And really what they're doing is they're not going through that a ton of that process that we just talked about with all of the other baijus and stuff. Soju is something where they actually get a rectified spirit and then they kind of redistill it, filter it and flavor it. So it's like industrial-ish almost in its aspect. Most of these are water white with delicate raw material aromas, soft textures. Um, there's a lot of experimentation and diversity being introduced into the category, like everywhere else. Not something we really need to talk about too much. Distilled soju, though, so this is where they basically take a rectified spirit and just kind of like modify it. Here, they're actually distilling it. You have raw materials such as rice, barley, and sweet potatoes. Your enzyme sources are Nuruk and Ipkuk. That's something you actually might want to remember for distilled soju. And like we talked about koji before and chu, that's the same or the equivalent to that in this type of production. This is Korea, I think, by the way. So distillation is often done in single pots. It's a much smaller type of process, and you get a much more refined kind of product. A lot of this stuff is actually matured in these large ceramic pots, which does impart a little bit of flavor, but it's fairly neutral. The fact that they're ceramic versus earthenware means that they're basically glazed. They don't allow for evaporation and whatnot. So it's really just a way for the product to kind of come together. It doesn't really age that long. Very, very small amounts of it. Sometimes see a little bit of oak aging. But these are not something that we would really ever see unless you went to Asia. But kind of interesting. And we're not going to taste those either. All right. So that kind of brings us to the end of the Asian spirits world for the moment.